My name is Ajena Rogers, and I'm the Supervisory Park Ranger at Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site. I worked at Valley Forge National Historic Park for 13 years minus 2 days. For me, marching just became such an integral part of my life. I came into Valley Forge in 1997 in August. My first major experience of a major interpretive program there was marching, and it was magical because we had it down at the Washington's headquarters area there before it was renovated the way it is now. And to have the experience of the cool day, cool evening, and the lights and the people in living history clothing, and going through with the lanterns there, it just brought a mood that I never was able to shake. I always wanted more. So after a few years of being there, I became the coordinator for the march-in program, first down at the Washington's headquarters area, because when we were first doing it, it was one that they would move it. We would move the program from place to place. And there was the year in 2002 that I directed the march-in program, and I was 8.5 months pregnant at the time. So that was very much of a challenge. I was in full living history clothing with high heels there, telling Tom, you got to move that tour because you're running late. And people was like, Ajena, have a seat. You're going to have that baby right now. But I was like, no, we got to get this program going. And my daughter fortunately held back and was born 7 days later after we finished up all of the activities for march-in. So everything I would do I wouldn't even start my Christmas shopping until after march-in was done, because it was such a part of the community, the group that we had. It was a way for Rangers past and present to come together. It was really hard work, but we always celebrated with each other afterwards. And that became part of the tradition, part of the joy of the march-in. Then there was the year that we also, this was really fun, we marched in actually from the Gulf. Several of us got dressed in our living history clothing and went down to where the train station is now and marched from the Gulf along the highway past the King of Prussia Inn in full gear. And I have some great pictures of that. Particularly, my favorite is of Bill Freilich, who was a volunteer here, there at Valley Forge, pressing this crosswalk button so that we could march across the highway on our way back to Valley Forge. But as we got to the hill below Muhlenberg's brigade, the 2nd Pennsylvania Regiment joined with us, and we fell into formation, and we actually marched into the huts. Can't be beat, can't be beat. Every year, families, community members, and living historians, reenactors would set that day aside, no matter if it was on a Wednesday or a Monday or what. They would set that day aside to come to that program for 2 hours, to be put into that place, that time, that space on this ground. And that, again, shows the power of living history, power of the story, the power of the place. It's very, very special to me, still is now. I still have a problem trying to get my Christmas shopping started before the 19th of December. I just can't do it. I started with the National Park Service in 1984 as a student between my freshman year and my sophomore year of college at James Madison University. I was a seasonal on the Blue Ridge Parkway and worked there for 6 seasons, eventually becoming a co op student. Didn't go right into the Park Service right away, but after 2.5 years of doing this, that, and the other thing, I realized that the Park Service really was my calling. And I came back in at Booker T. Washington National Monument, then worked for about 2.5 years at Independence National Historic Site before landing at Valley Forge in 1997. And I got there August 3rd of 1997. My husband and I moved to Valley Forge, where he was working in the law enforcement division and I was working in interpretation, and really became immersed in the history and the culture there at Valley Forge. For the most of my career from the beginning, I had devoted myself to living history and doing characters, researching historical people and creating their characters so that I could relate their stories through the arts, through first person interpretation mainly. And I'd had a lot of experience doing that for the Blue Ridge Parkway with a character called Granny Foster, and then later creating a character, Rachel Hatcher, when I was at Booker T. Washington Monument. So coming into Valley Forge after working at a living historical farm at Booker T. Washington Monument, it gave me the ability to get into a new century and get into the clothing, and get into the people, their lives there at Valley Forge. So, it was the best of experiences to be able to put on that 18th century persona, even particularly when I was doing it in third person, doing the demonstrations, hauling the water, uh, cooking over an open fire, being out at the huts. Oh, that was so amazing. Even my daughter, when she was really little, she would come out to the huts with us, and she can still remember, even at age 17 today, the smell of the apple pie that we had just cooked, and we'd gone back into the cabin and to eat it when the rain was coming down. There's nothing quite like that experience of being being able to go back into times like that. And I think that's what I enjoyed most about Valley Forge. Um, and it prepared me in many ways for the experiences that I have now. That now I'm no longer a frontline interpreter as I was all those years, but that hasn't left me that desire to create an atmosphere and help others learn to do that as well. One of the people that I've researched the most, particularly at the time I was there at Valley Forge, was the person who worked in George Washington's headquarters building as an enslaved cook, and her name was Negro Hanna. Later, she, through working for the general for 6.5 years and for a few months for Lafayette, she and her husband earned their enough money to buy their freedom and name themselves Hannah Till. So it's shorthand to call her Hannah Till. But during the time that she was at Valley Forge, she would have been known as Servant Hannah or Negro Hannah or Hannah Mason after her master, the person who owned her. By doing the research into Hannah, though, I was able to discover that people were interested in hearing not only about the well-known or the famous people who were at the encampment, but they wanted to learn more about the people that might be more like what they might have been if they had been picked up from their time and put into George Washington's time. What I learned about Hanna was that she was there and present in the records, but you really had to search for her. The way I first learned about her was through looking at some of the account books, Caleb Gibbs' account books, I believe it was, and he was keeping a track of all the expenses. And you kept saying names like Negro Hanna or Isaac, money for Isaac to buy things, and money for washing for Peggy Lee. And it turned out that these people were right there, part of Washington's family of his household, as he would say. The servants and the slaves who were there, who in the background were keeping everything running. It really helped us open up the story to show that George Washington's headquarters was a very, very busy place. People coming and going, uh, congressmen coming in to check on things, and officers coming by, and soldiers on relief coming by. And then who is keeping all of those things running? It Until Mrs. Washington got there, it would have been Mrs. Thompson, who was the housekeeper and traveled with George Washington for many years, and Peggy, and Hannah and Isaac, all of them were there, so making sure that everything was running smoothly and running well. And then when Mrs. Washington would come in, she would step into that role of managing the household, but they would work with and for her as they were going along. Noah Lewis, who portrays Ned Hector, who was another person, an African American man who worked and was at Valley Forge as a wagoner. Noah really researched Ned Hector's story. And while he was researching Ned Hector's story, he ran across an account that was showing detail about Hannah. And she was being interviewed when she was about more than 100 years old. I think she was 102 at the time. And it turns out that she passes away at age 104. But she was interviewed for the Annals of Philadelphia. And in this account I had become familiar with, it talks about her impressions of George Washington and what it was like for her to work for him. But Noah found an older manuscript of that record, and it listed that she was a pastry cook, that she was a pastry chef. So think about this: George Washington traveling through and during the time of the American Revolution was traveling with people who were skilled enough to have a specialty, such as being a pastry cook. George Washington was trying to upkeep the trappings of civility, even in the midst of the hardships of war, because of how you were expected to be in that time in the 18th century. It was a gentlemanly time, and they were just not backwoods people. They were trying to make sure that people knew that they were fighting for freedom for their country, that they were of the same level as the English gentlemen and officers that they were. Hannah and Isaac and the others who were working in the general's household were adding to that sense of normalcy for George Washington's level and expectation of a person of his status. So when you're trying to piece together a story of someone who has not been written about as extensively as the officers at Valley Forge per se, you do have to collect sources where you can find them and piece those sources together, because in their lifetime these individuals were not considered important enough to write about. Or another way to look at it, sometimes your presence is in between the day-to-day items that are written down. So the sources that we used, that I used for researching Hannah's life, came down to the account books. These documents are available online through the Library of Congress, because they, at some point in time, um, by the time I was doing the research on Hannah in the early 2000s, were had been digitized and were deposited in the Library of Congress. So when you're flipping through these books, these daily records, I'd see a little reference to the people that I was most in. And then you had the interview, that because she had lived so long and was such a well-known person in towards the end of her life, living in Philadelphia, that when they were looking for aged people who had lived through the time of the Revolution, and as the 1820s were coming along, of course, Hannah was one of those that got interviewed. And with that, it captured even more of her story. Rangers, years and years before me, had started to look for the stories of the individual soldiers, with a particular eye for telling and learning about the stories of the African Americans and Black soldiers that were there, part of the Rhode Island Regiment, integrated into all of the other regiments. So the Joe Beckton, for example, had created a list back in 1987 of all the names of soldiers that he thought could be traced as being of African descent. And this was about the time that the monument to the patriots of African descent was being uh, brought to the forefront and being brought together by the ladies of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And that was a very challenging bit of research to have to do, because the Army records didn't really designate people by race at that time. So you had to take, Joe Beckton had to take the names that were on the roster and then go forward into the censuses or other references, little little things that were noted about us to infer whether they were patriots of African descent or not, and ended up with this long list of people who had been there. All of these things were pieces that I would start to put together sitting in the windowsill at Washington's headquarters. And sometimes it could be pretty quiet there, and it would be time to read through the daily account records and think about who else was there. But altogether, I thought this was just something that I was interested in, something that was fun for me to do. However, one day I was there at Washington's headquarters when a teacher came in, and she was doing some research for a program, research for an education program for her students. She came from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and we started doing a little small talk there. And I went into my normal greetings. Welcome to Washington's headquarters. This is the place where General Washington and his staff lived for the 6 months of the Valley Forge winter encampment. Then she turned to me and said, "But who else was here? What about the others who were here?" And at that point, I couldn't give her an answer. I had known their names, had read about them in the book, in the daily record books, but had not really delved deep at that point into finding out their individual stories. Nor did I realize that there were people who might want to know about that, who others who might be interested in the things that interested me. So because of that one question from a visitor, from Susan Graham, um, I really launched into taking those bits and pieces and scraps and trying to find more about the others, and to help expand the stories of who was there. And in that way, I hoped in the long run that we would have even more people that visitors could identify with, that we could broaden the relevance of the stories that we tell. Because in Hanna, you had a story of a person who was working for people who were fighting for freedom while she was being held in bondage. How do you reconcile that? How did George Washington's officers, such as John Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton, reconcile that? Did those young men go along with the prevailing idea that it was fine to talk about slavery, fine to talk about Britain's tyranny and enslaving us while keeping others perpetually in bondage? So it brought up the stories of how youth can often look at things in a different way than the elders and shake things up. There was a lot to the stories of Hanna. There was a period of time where they were trying to find where the temporary tent had been put behind George Washington's headquarters, the Potts House. And there was one year that archaeologists came to dig the area behind the house. And in that archaeological dig, they uncovered a piece of pottery, actually a piece of ceramic cup. It turns out that that cup matched the traveling set of cups that George Washington had. They put that cup piece in my hand, and I trembled because realizing Hanna most likely had touched that herself. Could think of a story perhaps of how it got broken and how along the way they had to toss it out and threw it and left it there behind the headquarters building for us to find more than 200 years later. To be able to reach across the years in that way was something that I'll never forget. And it just gave me more incentive to try to talk about that complex relationship of slavery in a time when you were espousing the principles and ideas of freedom. To think about how can someone expect, if you're talking about freedom for yourselves and people like yourselves and for your elite group, how can you not expect the person who's carrying that cup to ignore those words, to not hear those words, not to want that freedom for themselves? So that became part of the story as I was interpreting and portraying Hanna at Washington's headquarters. So what we would do is that we would set up, as we always did at Washington's headquarters. There was a period of a summer or two, at least one summer, where we offered special programming, and that visitors would come to Washington's headquarters. They would see the headquarters house, and then they'd come down the steps and go to the kitchen where I would be dressed and be in first person character as Hanna. We always made sure that the people would know what as they came, that they would know that I was back in time, that I would answer their questions as Hanna. And this, in that way, worked pretty well because they weren't just thrown into a scenario without knowing the rules and how to play the game. I would find that people would ask things as simple as, what are you cooking here today? What is the general's favorite food? To something as hard and complex as, what does it feel like to be a slave? And though, of course, none of us can really convey the fullness of what it would be like to be enslaved, I felt by the conversations and the things that I was able to pick up through my studies and through talking with others and immersing myself into the environments there of the backdrop of Valley Forge, that I could at least lead people to a better understanding of what it might be like if they were in that situation. When you put yourself in first person as an African American interpreter, it brings a lot of weight. I'd almost say baggage when you do this. You have to be prepared to channel some of the pain that the person you're representing undoubtedly felt. You have to be prepared for people who bring their own, as we all do, bring our own biases and stories that have been told to them. They bring that with them to the program. And so there's the risk that the person listening to you will look at you as a person lesser than themselves, that they will pick up a superior air and apply that. And then you begin to feel what the society that espouse supremacy, white male supremacy at that time, what it would be like. And uh, it's very easy to be put into a box as they would be put into a box. That's the challenge. But the uplifting part of that is, in your mind, you also remember that this is an opportunity for you to speak for someone who was not able to speak for themselves. You may not be able to lay the person out like you want to, but you can try to figure out how to get the point across that this isn't good, this isn't cool, and that I am an individual with hopes and dreams, ambition, skill, desire to have a family just like anyone else, the desire to be an individual, be treated as an individual. I found that with first person interpretation, there were times I could only do it for a certain period. It wasn't something that I could do all day, because you have to be able to step back from that character, step back from that person. But it also makes me remember that they weren't able to step out like I can. It makes me, as an interpreter, respect them even more. It reminds us too that in the times that we are in now, you can't shed your skin to be what somebody else wants you to be. You cannot be other than who you are. Yet, you cannot shed who you are and who you currently are and the circumstances that are currently around you, but you can be inspired by those who came before, who endured. The other part about doing interpretation in first person is that you also can get a sense, feel what they feel for just a brief moment. And sometimes you have to find the same way to release those feelings that they did in the ways that they did, with a song or with a laugh or a joke or something like that, to help bring themselves up. And it shows the resilience of the human spirit and how the things that help uplift us now are the same things that uplifted them then, and are those things they have passed down to us. We should not reject that. We should embrace the music, the stories, the humor. Bring that to be a part, and make it all makes them as human as we are today. Helps us put ourselves in those places, walk a little bit in their shoes, and then helps us to walk our own walk. Now, I want to remind everyone that Hanna's story is just a representation of the Black experience at Valley Forge. She was a person whose story we were able to piece together through various accounts and resources that survived because she was associated with someone who was himself well known. You can be more well known than General Washington at Valley Forge. Yet, for the hundreds of African Americans there, you had just as many different experiences because they were all individual. Each person had their own story. Some may have been there because they were substituting as a soldier, substituting for another white person. Others may have been free Blacks who enlisted in the Army. They some had been promised their freedom because of the service they would do. And Hanna, during her term of service, does earn enough to purchase her freedom. Others who were enslaved and working towards the end of getting their freedom had it taken back away from them. They never got it. They had to petition to the legislatures of the states to secure their freedom. There are so many more stories to research and look into uh, for the experiences of Blacks in the encampment and during the Revolution, for the experiences of women in during the Revolution, to just the everyday soldier. There's so many stories out there. We'll probably never run out of those stories. But we have to start somewhere, and starting with well-known people like Hanna or Billy Lee. That is that's our jumping off point to find out more. So let's think about if we were to have a list of prominent people of African descent in a portrait or a painting. Where would Hanna fall? I believe she would be a part of that portraiture, because she and her husband were able to establish themselves as independent entrepreneurs in freedom after the revolution. They were members of the Presbyterian Church there, so I would presume that they were considered to be leaders in their church community. Maybe not as well known as Richard Allen or those of his caliber, but he also had experience working as a wagoner for the Continental Army during the American Revolution. So you would have a whole list of people who had been enslaved and would make their mark on cities such as Philadelphia, like Absalom Jones did, and in other towns, other cities, in like Charleston, South Carolina, or Boston, or New York. You could fill an entire poster or wall with these people who would leverage their experience during slavery to create a community, to create a life that would inspire others who came behind them. And they would be uplifted as an example of what could be done. Not to have their spirit squashed or quashed by the circumstances they were surrounded by. I believe also on that list you would have those who were working towards the end of, towards ending slavery. And they would be a part of that too. The filming experience of coming back to Valley Forge after having been away for several years was a moment of a lifetime, I should say. To really bring forward and fully dress in the most accurate way possible, and have the set of being in the dining room of Washington's headquarters. Uh, the feel of the linens and interacting with Martha Washington as Hanna would have done. It, it's hard to describe, honestly. It really, really is hard to describe, because it was the culmination of all of the work that we had done over the time. And I also want to say, though, in that movie, Hanna is only a representation of the people that were part of that group. We didn't have William Lee there right at Washington's side. You saw briefly Peggy there, who married William Lee. Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper, was in her 70s when she started working for General Washington. It was just a sliver of the people that were there, but I'm very, very glad that Hanna was chosen to be the one to represent all of them, so that people can then want to know more about the others who were there, and then to have that continue forward. Uh, you know, as an interpreter, when you do research at a certain place, uh, you do your research in the time and the place that you're there, and you never know if it's going to be kept and go forward. You never know if all that work that you've done will be remembered or brought up ever again, dusted off and used ever again. So to have Hanna be a part of it, and see all my old friends again too, and to see Sam who grew up. Oh my goodness. You started when he was 5. He was about 5 when I left, and just to see people come into the characters and be who they are, and I know Dave Lawrence and Jonathan, and just to be back with the old gang again, Donna McDermott. Um, yeah, just yeah, it felt great to be a part of that once again. If I could ask Hanna something personal, if I could have that piece of Washington's pottery and hold it and jump and have it send me back in time to stand there right in front of her, I would ask her, what does she want for her family? What does she foresee her family's life to be like? Because I know I have recently been learning more about my own family, particularly on my mother's side, where we can trace back to Martha Ann Fields, who was born in 1813. Hannah was still alive at that time, where my great 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 grandmother was born here in Virginia. And it's recorded what her thoughts were for her family, even though she was enslaved. And she had a deep faith and belief that someday her family would be free, and that they would have a great education, and that they would be able to live as they needed to live. And because my great 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 grandmother, had that faith and that drive and took action to make sure that her children and grandchildren got a good education. That is why I am here today. Did Hanna have that same kind of outlook for her family? Did she pass that spirit along? Are they out there somewhere, but just don't realize that the desire of an ancestor from the American Revolution is why they are still striving and thriving today? I think that's the thing I would ask. And also, what's a good recipe that I can share? What's the best pastry recipe that you could have? So the story of Hannah and her husband Isaac doesn't end with the end of the American Revolution. Uh, we do know from the annals of Philadelphia that Hannah ends up living in Philadelphia, and there's a letter that actually I forgot to mention earlier, where William Lee is back at Mount Vernon with George Washington. He uh, is married to Peggy, who was the washerwoman for the household. And George Washington writes a letter on behalf of William Lee to try to get Peggy to come back down and live with him at Mount Vernon. And in that letter, it says that she's living with Isaac and Hannah Till, who are cooks in Philadelphia. So we have those. That's a piece of a record that actually was one of the jumping off points for me to start burrowing down and find out more about their story. And with that, I was able to get a fuller picture myself of what her background would be. But then I ended up moving to a new job at at Maggie Walker National Historic Site. Um, I was able to take the story to a certain point with my research and even turned it into a master's thesis with a series of education programs and living history programs that I was doing. I was not able at that point in time to find out more specifics, such as where she was buried. Did she have any descendants? What was her life like in Philadelphia? But fortunately, uh, 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 Dr. Lane picked up the story. She was one of the daughters of the American Revolution and became a leader, president, I believe, of that organization because she could trace her ancestry back to an African American soldier who was at the Valley Forge encampment. And Dr. Lane picked up the story, and others picked up the story until recently, and long after I had left Valley Forge, they pinpointed where Hanna was buried. They also they also had a grand ceremony to mark her gravesite, to mark her as a patriot of the American Revolution. And others through research were able to find that she had had a son that was baptized. So I can let's keep it going. Let's see what else we can find in those records. And it would be great to be able to bring that that generational experience and find out what else happened and see if we can find a descendant of Isaac and Hannah and have them come to some of the programs. You never know. Because we're all part of a continuum, all part of it. Someday our people will be telling our story. What will they have to work with? What will they have to truly tell about the things that we are currently going through? Because what we are doing now will be affecting people for generations to come. How do I know this? Because through the Park Service and the stories that we tell and even the ones that have been untold for far too long, we can trace the things that have uplifted us as a people and things that have torn us apart as a people. We need to keep these stories going and broaden the stories so that we don't shut people out from these places that are so important. I mean, that's why we set them aside in the first place, because of the scenery, the natural beauty, this historic objects, the wildlife. I mean, when I was a kid ranger, I used to every summer recite the Organic Act. Now that is so goofy, but it's right on my wall today, right here in this office, so that I can remember why I'm here, why I was invited to be a part of this National Park Service family, and why I want to help people like Jonathan Parker when he wanted to become a ranger so badly when we met that evening at March Inn.
Photograph of former Chief of Interpretation Jonathan Parker standing next to director Per Argentine, who is at the camera shooting a winter scene.
And Peter Mogul, the future of interpretation, as we used to call him. And lots of folks that interns and people that have come through, I reach out to them because people reached out to me, brought me into the National Park Service to tell a larger story. A bit of advice that I would give to new park rangers or people who want to explore the less told stories is, first of all, to know the larger story, because you are expected to know that as well. And then as you research the undertold stories, you are better able to connect those stories to the larger picture, and then people will begin to hear and listen. Because if you just are telling the the story that hasn't been told as often, uh, to someone who's coming and expecting the story that they all always heard, they may turn you out, may tune you out, may turn away. So it always has to be able, you always have to be able to relate it to the larger story. As an interpreter, as an African American interpreter, expected to be able to interpret the traditional main story. But the story of people who look like me had once been considered an add on, a niche. It is not. We all should be able to tell some bit of all of these stories in the normal, everyday run of our interpretation and relate them to the traditional normative narrative. It doesn't take away from the narratives that we have been taught in school or that we have heard coming up. It's like giving you a something that's already been digested first, but then as you come along and you become more aware of the larger world, you start to get something that's more meaty, something that you have to chew on. That is the way it is for interpretation. That you start with a baseline and then add more variety. It becomes like a, instead of having this the same old meal over and over and over again, it's presented more as a smorgasbord where you can get a variety, and then it's a more satisfying story in the end, a more satisfying meal in the end. So please do go and do some of that special research. Bring more of these stories in. And I think it'll be better for everyone as they become more intoned and more immersed in the stories. They'll walk away and maybe come back wanting more because it's not the same old, same old, same old. The things that I would want people to take away from Hanna's history and the research that we've done is that it takes all people to to have it takes all people living in this world to make the experiences that we talk about in our national parks. There, this may sound right, but there are no small stories to be told. The larger story has to be broken down into smaller parts. And if you can take a person such as Hanna and break the story down into a part that someone out there can identify with, that's doing an incredible service to those who come and visit our special places that we protect and preserve. If you can make the people that are in these places uh, human, to, for example, when we talk about Maggie Walker, we talk about her day-to-day life, the struggles and troubles that she had. Uh, it makes them uh, relatable, not so unattainable, not so much on a pedestal. That is the way that we are functioning and living in this world now. Uh, it's not that they are not our heroes. We need to have our heroes too, but we also know that heroes stumble sometimes. So to help to unpack some of the complexities of day-to-day life, it's stories of people such as Hanna that help us to do that, help us to unpack the complex stories. If you think life is cut and dry, this and not that, then you haven't really been living. Um, that is what I hope people will be able to take from Hannah's story and the research that we've done. Um, just to realize that it doesn't have to all be about perfection, and it doesn't have to be all about perfection only. We can still be good people even when we have um, things have flaws. So when we are recreating the events of Martin, and when I am in my living history clothing and looking back and trying and being a part of that time period as much as I possibly can as a modern individual, I do wonder exactly what was Hannah's experiences. Um, and knowing that, I imagine it, you're going through that, slogging through the mud, the rain is still falling on you. You still have, and she still would have had the responsibility of getting the meals together for the general and his household. To still have to carry forward with the job at hand, in spite of the conditions that are coming and swirling around you. I try to put myself in that place, and I try to think, can I be as strong as she had to be? I would hope so. When they talked about the big birthday that they had, that birthday celebration for George Washington in February of 78, I'd want to ask Hannah, how did they get all of that together? If you look at the list of food that they had to prepare, how in the world did she and Isaac and all of the helpers that they had pull off so that people were still talking about it more than 200 years later? I mean, that is incredible. You have to be a really good cook for someone to be talking about your meal that far along in the future. So yeah, I would like to hear all about that day. That's what I would ask too.